Hello, and welcome to the Joy of Drafting. This is Travis Semulin Sowers, and today we're going to learn about the mana curve. A while back, while streaming on Twitch, a few of my viewers suggested that I undervalued the card Honey Mammoth. I responded very maturely and picked every Honey Mammoth I saw in the next draft. I ended up with 6, and I played them all. That deck didn't do very well. I often found myself with a handful of Honey Mammoths and not enough lands in play to cast them. I did this to myself, and we had a fun time on the stream, but I've seen new players do this by accident and not realize what they did wrong or why they kept losing. Whether you're doing it on purpose or by accident, if you break the law of the mana curve, you're not going to win many games. When Magic players refer to a mana curve, they're asking you to lay out your creatures and sort them by casting cost. In an ideal situation, your pile of cards would be larger in the 2-drops and smaller in the 6 or 7s. Many games of Limited are over quickly if an opponent is curving out. Curving out is when you're able to cast a spell on each turn, usually starting on turn 2, but sometimes turn 1, and hit your spells and land drops. Casting a 2-mana creature, a 3-mana creature, and then a 4-mana creature can sometimes be enough to win a game of Magic. Stumbling and not playing a creature on turn 2 or 3 can sometimes be the reason you lose. It's also important to understand the relation to the casting cost of a creature to the turn you can cast it. If you come from Hearthstone or any of the other digital card games that don't have variance in the mana system, you're likely used to seeing a 6-drop as something you can always play on turn 6. This is not the case in Magic. If you miss one land drop, you'll not be able to cast it until turn 7. Miss 2? We're looking at turn 8. You can generally assume while you're building your deck that you can cast your 2-drops on turn 2 and 3s on turn 3, but after that, be aware that you may miss a land drop. How should you take this into account when drafting? When drafting, make sure you keep your curve in mind. If you see a good 2 or 3 drop, value it more than the 6 drop in the pack, unless the 6 drop is a legitimate bomb. Don't worry, we'll cover bombs, both legitimate and illegitimate, in a future episode. Most decks will play 4 or more 2 drops and 4 or more 3 drops, but usually only 1 or 2 6 drops. This means you should value good early plays a bit higher than non-premium late plays. You need more of them, both to have the opportunity to curve out and stand up against your opponent's curve. Some limited games are functionally over before turn 7 or 8, which means you'll get to play your good early cards more often. In general, you'll want around 15 creatures in your deck. I'd try to have around 4 in the 2-mana slot, 4 to 5 in the 3-mana slot, 3 to 4 in the 4-mana slot, 2 to 3 in the 5-mana slot, and 1 or 2 in the 6+ slot. Some formats are more about big creatures than little ones. Others favor small creatures attacking. Regardless of format specifics, understanding what a mana curve is and drafting with it in mind will make you a better drafter. If you aim for this configuration, you'll have a deck that can function in any format. There are a few other types of cards to consider when you're talking about the curve. One is modal spells that can make a creature, and the other is your spell slots, instants, sorceries, enchantments, and such. With all of these, you'll need to think more about when you'd want to cast it rather than when you can cast it. Let's start by talking about a premium removal spell. Murder is an often cited removal spell for Limited these days. 1 black, instant, destroy target creature. Murder may not be in the set you're drafting, but odds are there's a black removal spell for around 3 mana that works about the same way. You can cast Murder on turn 3, but you'd rarely want to. Generally, you want to save premium removal like this for your opponent's best card. That makes it not really fit into the 3-drop slot of your deck. For this reason, you'll often see Limited players make separate piles for spells and creatures. Remember that you can use Murder on turn 3 though. If your opponent is attacking you with a 4/2 and you don't have any other plays in hand, it's better to murder the raptor than die with the Murder in your hand. If you have an aura to enhance one of your creatures, it may not fit into the curve either. You'll need to have a creature out to play it, and you may often want to wait until your opponent has used a few removal spells to make sure you're not putting all your eggs into one neatly murdered basket. This is another reason to mainly look at creatures when you're planning out your curve. Most creatures are ones that you're happy to play out as soon as you have the mana to do so, as most games of Limited are won by attacking with creatures. There are some spells that are okay to put in your curve. Essence Scatter, which we talked about in the last episode, is a great example of this. You can use it on turn 2 and are happy to do so. Deadweight and Shock are another example. More often than not, when you have spells like these two, you can cut a 2-drop from your deck. Most of what these spells do is trade for an opponent's 2-drop and allow you to spend a bit less mana dealing with the threat than your opponent used to cast it. We'll have an entire episode devoted to how and when to use removal, but for now, get in the habit of thinking, what turn do I want to be casting this card on, instead of what turn can I cast this card on. That will help you organize your cards into your curve. The other card type to note is modal cards. The kicker mechanic has been seen in limited formats in some form for the past 20 years. Old farts like me who've played Magic for a long time often joke that every mechanic that has a flexible casting cost is just kicker. We're kinda right. Cycling? It's just kicker. Split cards? They're kicker too. The idea with kicker cards, or split cards, or cycling cards, is that you have two or more modes on the card, often with different casting costs and effects. Let's look at Greater Sandworm as an example. You can pay 7 mana to get a 7/7 that's hard to block, or you can draw a card for 2 mana. This is a flexible card. It can be a turn 2 play or a turn 7+ play. Get to Chronicler is another example. You can spend 2 mana for a 1/3 or 6 mana for a 1/3 and your best spell from your graveyard. Spells and creatures that have this flexibility built into either side of your curve are often valuable to have access to. When you're laying them out on your curve, think about when you want to cast them. When you're in the game, be alert for situations where you have to use them early. In your mana curve, the Greater Sandworm was in your 7-drop slot, but don't be afraid to cycle it on turn 2 if you're short on lands. Fear is the mind killer. No one's happy to play out Get to Chronicler on turn 2, but if your opponent has a pair of 2/1s attacking, it's better to stop the assault and survive to take control of the board. Having a solid curve of creatures in your deck will win you some games by curving out while your opponent stumbles. It will also allow you to survive some games where your opponent curves out by having enough blockers. A good curve means you'll get to play more games of Magic rather than having a handful of honey mammoths that don't care about your lack of mana. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please consider liking the video and telling a friend about the series if you find it useful. You can also check out my Twitch stream to see draft theory put into practice at www.twitch.tv/Semulin. Join us next time on Sponsor Quest, The Joy of Drafting, where we'll start to talk about pick orders and how to draft Brave.